24 years since it was last published, I still miss Bill Watterson's wonderful comic strip, Calvin and Hobbes, about a young boy, Calvin, and his tiger, Hobbes, who is stuffed or imaginary to everyone else, but as real can be to Calvin. The strip could be funny, at times sentimental, sometimes wickedly cynical or deeply philosophical. Watterson could make the reader think more with 5 or 6 cartoon panels than 5 or 6 hours of typical television programming elicits. And sometimes, Watterson used the strip just to play around. I remember one Sunday comic that began with Calvin saying, "Something is seriously wrong here. The laws of perspective have been repealed. Objects no longer diminish in size with distance. Lines do not converge toward any point on the horizon." And as Calvin speaks, he dashes through the increasingly distorted and disorienting panels of the comic strip, where floors have become walls and staircases look like twisted alien life forms, and lamps sit impossibly askew on improbably constructed tables. "All spatial relationships are lost," cries Calvin. "It's impossible to judge where anything is. Oh no!" And about this time, Calvin's mother intrudes as the voice of reality, shouting, "Calvin, quit running around crashing into things or I will sell you to the monkey house." And in the final panel, Calvin grumbles to himself, "Now she's lost perspective." Frankly, not all that funny as punchlines go. That whole comic strip was likely just an excuse for Watterson to play with drawing distorted perspectives and bizarre points of view. He often looked for ways to bring a new level of artistry or visual interest to the Sunday comics. And as artistic accomplishments go, it was pretty interesting. Sort of Escher meets Picasso meets Marcel Duchamp's nude descending a staircase. But there's really no high humor or deeper message there until you begin to wonder, what would it feel like? What would it be like to live in a world that has completely lost perspective? What would it feel like and what would it be like if I began to lose perspective? What's real and what's not? What's important? What's not? Where is the level ground? What am I doing here? I can say this much. If Calvin's frenzied running around through chaotic and unpredictable surroundings was half as tiring as it appeared, then he must have been utterly exhausted. And his running around chaotically crashing into things accomplished nothing constructive, but was potentially destructive. No wonder his mother yelled in exasperation and threatened to ship him off to the monkey house. He was wearing her out too. And then I think, one of the most common and chronic complaints I hear these days is that people are exhausted. Not in the purely physical sense of not having slept enough or of having worked too hard and overdone it, but in an emotional sense. In a spiritual sense, in an ontological sense, which is to say that we are exhausted to the depths of our being. I had a conversation just this week with someone who kept saying, "I'm just tired." And tired meant so many things, I think. It sounded like tired meant discouraged, world-weary, 2 quarts low on hope, a little bit cynical, and feeling as if much of life was running around chaotically and accomplishing nothing very constructive. That conversation re-emphasized for me why the Sabbath and the practice of Sabbath keeping is of such surpassing importance for our spiritual and emotional well-being. Now, I should first say that in our current, busy, modern-day culture, Sabbath is hardly even an afterthought. Sabbath seems like the irrelevant commandment. Like violating it is hardly even a theological misdemeanor. Seems a bit like jaywalking when it's compared to thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not commit adultery. But Sabbath keeping had some genuine importance to God. It made the top 10 list of commandments, after all. In fact, among all the commandments, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy gets the most ink, as if its importance demands further explanation as compared to the other commandments. In Exodus 20's listing of the commandments, the Sabbath is justified because God created the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day God rested and reflected upon God's labors. And we, therefore, are commanded to set aside a day to rest and reflect upon God's labors. Not merely a day to relax, or to take in a ball game, or go to a movie, or read a book, or nap, though those activities can be restorative in their own right, but a day to recall our place in the created order, to remember that the world is a result of God's industry and not ours. Why is that important? In the movie Bruce Almighty, Jim Carrey plays a man who voices constant complaint about God's ordering of the world. So God, played by Morgan Freeman, offers Bruce a chance to sit in the big chair, so to speak, to play God's role for a time, to step into God's shoes and run the world, answer all the prayers, make the literal life or death big picture decisions. And there's a telling scene in the movie in which Bruce is utterly inundated, overwhelmed and paralyzed by the sheer volume of prayers. Prayers for healing, for hope, for guidance, for wisdom, for comfort. Only to discover that the impassioned outpouring that so overwhelms him is the prayer output of the greater Buffalo, New York area and no more. It's a quick lesson in perspective. You think you know everything, Bruce? You don't know half a scintilla of everything. And you don't have to be responsible for everything. Be still and know that I am God. And parenthetically, you are not. And in the movie, when God takes back over from Bruce, it's as though an immense burden has been lifted. Now, I think this sense of being inundated or overwhelmed that Bruce experiences is like the sense of exhausted despair that we encounter when we begin to imagine that everything depends on us. Of course, some things depend on us. We have jobs with expectations. We have family members and friends with needs. But everything does not depend on us. The Sabbath restores our perspective. We are not small g gods seeking to run the world like petty tyrants. The world depends on God's industry and not ours. And that's the truth that our scripture lesson from Matthew seeks to convey. It's an invitation to step back from our worry, back from our industry, to climb off of our hamster wheel, and to remember that life is a gift and that God provides for our needs. When Jesus invites his listeners to consider the lilies of the field, we can imagine him gesturing to nearby flowers and saying, "Look at these lilies. Really, look. Consider them. They grow. They flourish. They live. They die. God sends the sun and rain upon them. They endure dry seasons, bad weather, but they do not waste their energy on worthless worry. They occupy their place in the created order. Their focus is not on what they must do. They know simply how to be. And you who do so much, who hurry so much, who worry so much, must learn how to be." Now, if you want a short homework assignment, take a look and compare the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20 and in Deuteronomy chapter 5. They're quite nearly the same, even using the exact wording in most instances. The chief difference is that the justification for Sabbath offered in Deuteronomy is different from the one justified in Exodus, or offered in Exodus. Instead of making the Sabbath day a day to reflect upon whose industry defines the world, namely God's, the Deuteronomic listing of the commandments makes the Sabbath a day for remembering identity. Remember your heritage and where you came from. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Remember who you are. And that, I think, is another important aspect of restoring our perspective. How easy it is from day to day to forget who we are, or more precisely, to forget whose we are, and to live and behave as if we do not all belong to God. And if we forget our identity, it distorts our whole reality. I'll turn to another story as an illustration. One of the books in C.S. Lewis's treasured Chronicles of Narnia is The Silver Chair. And in the book, Prince Rilian, the crown prince and heir to the throne of Narnia, is taken captive by an enchantress. And he's spirited away to an underground city where he lives his life with an illusory and distorted worldview, an enchanted worldview of who he is and of what is even real. He's led to believe that he is the prince of an underground kingdom and that he belongs there, and that his life is ordered exactly as it should be, and that he will one day lead an army to conquer Narnia. But each day, for only an hour, he remembers his true identity. He remembers what the sun is like. He remembers where he came from. He remembers that he is not a child of the underground world, but is in fact the child of the true king. To keep him imprisoned, his captors daily tie him to the silver chair that is the book's title. He is bound until his madness passes and his true identity is regained. In the context of Deuteronomy, the importance of Sabbath is like that recurring brief interval in which Rilian remembers who he is and what is real and what is true. One removed that daily awareness, that sliver of insight, that recollection of his true identity, then Rilian would lose perspective completely, and down would be up, and left would be right, and life would not be meaningless per se, but it would have a counterfeit meaning. Now, holding that image in mind, how much of the time does life, or the world, or society, or the media spend offering to us or imposing upon us a sense of counterfeit meaning? This is the way the world works, we hear. Might makes right. Wealth makes power. The meaning of life is to accumulate things and to pursue security or comfort or eternal youth or immortality, or as close as we can come to it. In such a world, there are only winners and losers, and the one who disagrees with me is my enemy, and disaster threatens at every turn, and life in such a world requires a certain set of values and assumptions that we are invited increasingly to take on. Our culture invites us to take it on. Our leaders invite us to take it on. Advertisers invite us to take it on. And Sabbath is like that recurring interval of sanity, a restored perspective. Remember who you are. You were slaves in Egypt, homeless and in despair, trapped in an existence defined by power and wealth and people who acted like gods but weren't. And the Lord your God brought you out of that place with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. You need not fear the world. You're a child of God. You don't need to fear for your own security. You're a child of God. You are God's children. You are God's own. You are God's. Now take the Exodus perspective and the Deuteronomy perspective and put them together. Exodus, you are not small g gods. Deuteronomy, you are God's. You belong to God. That's the vital, life-giving, world-ordering perspective of the Sabbath. You are not God's. You are God's. Does the world too often feel like an out-of-perspective chaos, wildly tilting left and right where down is up, and we run around crashing into things and into each other? Hear then the assurance and the invitation of Sabbath as captured in Psalm 46, verse 10. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know. Be still. Be. Perspective restored. Amen.